When Maurice Carver clocked in for his first shift on the Gummy line at the candy factory he secretly owned. The plant manager took one look at the big new hire with a gap in his work history and decided to make an example of him before the morning break. The factory smelled like sugar and warm fruit, a cloud of it, the kind of smell that should make a place happy. Bright ribbons of red and green and gold gummy poured off the cooker line into molds. Maurice had on a hairnet, a borrowed apron, safety glasses, and a temp badge that read, Marcus T., new hire. 3 championship rings in a safe a long way off. A net worth that didn't fit on a single line. And a candy company, this one in his hometown of Eaton Springs, that he'd built for a reason almost nobody knew, which was the whole reason he was standing on the floor of it in a hairnet at 6 in the morning. The plant manager came down the line fast. Greg Mabry, 38, pressed shirt, lanyard, a clipboard he used like a weapon. He stopped in front of Maurice, looked him up and down, looked at the badge, looked at the gap on the intake sheet where a work history should be. Gap like that means one of 2 things, Mabry said, loud enough for the line. Lazy or locked up. Which were you? He didn't wait. Doesn't matter. You're on gum scrape. Floor under cooker 3's a disgrace. He kicked a hardened blob of dried gummy at Maurice's boot and held out a toothbrush. An actual toothbrush. All of it, before break. And I'm docking you a half hour for being slow already. And Maurice Carver took the toothbrush, got down on the floor of his own factory, and said absolutely nothing. He scraped, and he let his eyes move, the way they always did when a place built for one thing was being run as another. The first thing he noticed was the old man 2 stations down, 60-something, slow but sure, who waited until Mabry was gone and then crouched beside Maurice and slipped him a putty knife. Toothbrushes for show, the old man murmured. Use this, scrape with the grain, you'll beat the bell. And son, the gap don't mean nothing here. Half this floor's got one. That's the whole point of this place. Then he was back at his station before the boss turned around. The floor called him Unc. The second thing was the lockers by the time clock. The old man said L. Mabry. And the plant manager's office door, glass, across the floor, said G. Mabry, Operations. The same last name. Maurice filed it. The third thing was how Greg Mabry never once looked directly at the old man. He'd correct everyone on the line, ride them, bark. But when he passed Unc's station, his eyes slid away, every time, like the old man was a spot on the floor he'd trained himself not to see. The fourth thing was a photo taped inside Unc's open locker. A younger version of the old man, a woman with a wide, warm smile, and a little boy on his shoulders. The fifth thing was that Greg Mabry was hardest, cruelest, most relentless with exactly the workers who had the gaps. The second chance hires, the ones with records, riding them up, thinning them out, like he was personally offended by their presence in his building. Maurice noticed every one of them. He did not react. He scraped gum off his own floor with a putty knife and felt a story assembling under the sugar smell. Now here is the part that nobody on that Gummy line understood yet. The big new hire on his knees with a toothbrush owned the building, the brand, and the paychecks. And the cruelty he was watching the plant manager pour out on the men with gaps in their histories was not random meanness, and it was not really about any of them. It was about one man. The old man 2 stations down. And what tied the tyrant in the glass office to the gentle old-timer the floor called Unc was a secret so painful that when the whole factory finally heard it, the line would go silent and a hard man would weep into his own clipboard. What Greg Mabry had spent a year pretending not to know, what he'd built his whole cruelty around not facing, was one single fact about the old man he refused to look at. So stay with us for the whole video, because how the boss treated Big Mo on that line was wild, no question. But it was nothing next to what Big Mo uncovered about why that boss couldn't stand to look 2 stations down his own floor. Maurice Carver built this candy company for a reason he rarely said out loud. He grew up in Eaton Springs, watching the world decide who was disposable. He'd nearly been one of the disposable ones himself. A furious, grieving kid the schools had filed under lost cause before he was 14. And he had a brother, found late in life, who'd come home from hard years to a world that wouldn't hire him for love or money. A good man holding a $4 an hour night job because a gap on a page had slammed every other door. Maurice had learned the same lesson from both ends, that a person is so much more than the worst thing that ever happened to them, and that the cruelest thing a society does is decide a human being is finished at the age of their worst mistake. So when he built Moe's Candy Co., he built it as a second-chance employer, right in his hometown, a place that hired the people with the gaps, the records, the marks, the ones nobody else would touch, and trained them, and paid them fair, and bet on them being more than their file. For years it had worked. The floor was full of people getting their lives back, and the candy, somehow, tasted better for it. Then the numbers at the Eaton Springs plant had spiked. Productivity way up suddenly, under a new manager, but so had turnover among exactly the workers the place existed for. And a single anonymous complaint had reached Maurice's desk. So he'd done what he always did when he needed the truth instead of a dashboard. He'd put on a hairnet and a fake name and gone to see who his company was really being run for. He didn't know yet that the answer was tangled up with a wide, warm smile in a locker photograph, and a woman who'd been dead for 2 years. Greg Mabry had not always been a man who handed grown men toothbrushes. He was 38, and he had grown up as the convict's kid. When Greg was 9, his father, Leon, had gone to prison. A bad year, a bad choice. A nonviolent charge that nonetheless took 4 years and broke the family's back. And Greg had spent his entire childhood wearing it. The whispers. The kids who weren't allowed to play with him. The teachers who watched him like they were waiting. He decided, somewhere in there, that he would not be his father. He would be the opposite of his father. Clean, hard, respectable, upward, a man no one could ever whisper about. He clawed his way into management on pure white-knuckle shame, and he defined himself, every day, against the man who'd marked him. And then, a year ago, he'd been promoted to run the Eaton Springs plant, and walked onto the floor and found his father standing on the Gummy line. Leon Mabry, out for years now, debt long paid, unhirable everywhere else, had finally gotten a shot at the one company in town that hired men like him. He hadn't known his son ran it, and when the 2 men saw each other across that floor, Greg had not embraced his father. Greg had taken him into the glass office, closed the door, and told him in a shaking voice that nobody here could know. That if Leon breathed a word that they were related, it would all come out. The convict father, the whole thing. And Greg would lose everything he'd built himself into. You don't know me here. You're just another hire. And then, to make doubly sure no one ever suspected the respectable manager shared blood with an ex-con on his line, Greg had become the hardest man in the building on every worker with a record, distancing himself in the cruelest possible currency, his own father absorbing every bit of it in silence. He wasn't a monster. He was a 9-year-old who'd never stopped being ashamed, running a candy factory like a man trying to outrun a whisper. And he had no idea that the toothbrush he'd just handed out had gone to the man who signed his checks. The floor loved Unc Leon. He trained every new hire. He talked young Quincy, 24, fresh out, terrified, a kid 1 bad week from going back to the only life he'd known, through his first month, station by station, telling him the gap on his record was a comma, not a period. He kept the line laughing. He absorbed Greg Mabry's cruelty with a patience that the rest of the floor mistook for the meekness of an old man, and that Maurice was beginning to read as something else entirely. Miss Lurline, 71, who'd worked that line longer than anyone, watched it all from her packing station and said nothing, the way she'd said nothing for years. Then Greg Mabry made his move. He came onto the floor with a write-up and an audience, and he announced that he was letting Leon go. Too slow, he said, a liability, citing a quota the old man had missed because he'd spent 20 minutes that morning calming Quincy out of quitting. He fired the soul of the floor in front of the whole floor, and when Maurice, still Marcus T., still on gum scrape, stood up and said quietly that it wasn't right, Mabry rounded on him and fired him too, on the spot, for insubordination, and told them both to clock out and get off his property. And Leon Mabry took off his hairnet and folded his apron and did not say one single word in his own defense. Would not, even now, even fired, betray the secret that would shame his boy. But before you find out what Maurice did, before the thing under the sugar smell finally comes up into the light, you need to understand what that old man was swallowing in silence, and why. The line had stopped. Quincy was crying. Miss Lurline had stood up. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The whole factory held its breath. Maurice took off the hairnet and the safety glasses, and pulled the temp badge off his apron, and stood up to his full height, and Greg Mabry's clipboard sank slowly to his side as the big new hire became someone he recognized from a portrait in the corporate lobby. "My name is Maurice Carver," he said. "I own this company. I built it in this town to give the people everybody else throws away a real second chance. I came in here on my knees with a toothbrush to find out why my own floor suddenly had people running for the door." He looked around at the second chance hires Mabry had been grinding down. "Now I know." Greg Mabry had gone gray. But Maurice wasn't done, and he turned not to the boss, but to the old man holding his folded apron. "Unc," he said gently, "your locker says L. Mabry. His office says G. Mabry. Same name. You've taken a year of this man's cruelty without ever once defending yourself. And you just got fired and still wouldn't say the thing that would have stopped it." Maurice's voice dropped. "Leon, he's your son, isn't he?" The factory went utterly silent. Leon Mabry's eyes filled, and he looked at his boy across the floor. The boy he'd marked, the boy who couldn't look at him, the boy he'd taken a job he didn't need to be near. And he nodded, once. There was the convergence the whole floor had been standing inside without knowing it. The tyrant in the glass office and the beloved old man on the line were father and son. Greg Mabry hadn't been grinding down the men with records out of nothing. He'd been running from his own father's shadow, and the harder he tried to outrun the whisper, the crueler he'd become to the men who reminded him of it, including the one who'd given him life. And Leon had known. Leon had taken a floor job at his own boy's plant, swallowed a year of his son's shame, scraped and packed and absorbed every cutting word. For one reason, the reason he finally said out loud when Maurice asked him why a proud man would endure all that and never say a word. "Because," Leon said, looking at the son who couldn't look back, "he's still my boy. And Greg Mabry, 38 years old, respectable, hard, a man who'd spent a lifetime outrunning a whisper, put his face in his clipboard and broke completely. There had been a third person in that story for years, felt by both men and gone from the room. Estelle, Leon's wife, Greg's mother. She died 2 years back, And on her way out, she'd taken her son's hand and said the thing about his father that Greg had spent 2 years refusing to hear. The same thing, it turned out, that Maurice had built an entire company on without ever knowing her name. He's not what he did, baby. He never was. Go find your daddy. Greg had buried his mother and her words both. Now they were standing in the middle of his factory floor. Here is what Maurice did, and it was the hardest, most Moe's candy thing he could have done. He did not fire Greg Mabry and throw him out, even though the man had earned it 10 times over that morning. Because the entire company stood on one idea, that a person is more than their worst day. And Maurice was not about to abandon that idea for the one man who needed it most. "You've been cruel," he told Greg, low. "You hurt people who'd already been hurt enough. And there's going to be a reckoning for that. And you're going to make it right with every one of them. But your mother was right about your father, and she'd be right about you. You're not what you did this morning either, if you don't want to be." He nodded at Leon. "Your daddy took a year of you because he never stopped wanting his son back. Don't let your pride do what prison couldn't. Don't let it keep you two apart for good." He gave Unc Leon back his job and then some, made him the plant's official mentor for every new hire, a real title, real pay, the thing he'd been doing for free all along. He restored the line's withheld bonus, every dollar. He paid forward young Quincy's road out. And he gave Greg Mabry the one thing the company was built to give, and the one thing the man had never given anyone, least of all his father: a second chance, conditional on becoming the kind of man who hands people up instead of grinding them down, starting with the old man 2 stations down, who'd never stopped being his daddy. Estelle Mabry had said it dying, and Maurice had been saying it with a candy company for years, without knowing they were the same words. He's not what he did. Neither was Leon, neither was Greg. Neither is the kid with the gap on his resume, and neither are you. So look at what one shift on one Gummy line uncovered. A young man 1 bad week from going back, who got mentored and lifted instead. A floor full of second-chance workers who got their bonus and their dignity back. A hard, ashamed son handed the same grace he'd refused everyone else, and a road back to his own father. And an old man who took a year of cruelty and silence on the floor of a candy factory, for no reason on this earth except that the man dishing it out was still, and would always be, his boy. His late wife said it best, and a candy company was built on it without ever hearing her say it. He's not what he did. Not the convict, not the tyrant, not the kid with the gap. Not any of us on our worst day. And so should you believe it, about the people the world's already written off, and maybe about yourself. If somebody in your life is more than the worst thing they ever did, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button, because it helps stories about second chances reach the people who need one. And if you believe nobody is finished at the age of their worst mistake, subscribe and join this community. There are more of us than you'd think. And everybody here gets another shot. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. We will see you there.